Hi everybody, glad you're all here. I'm going to show you a slide presentation that talks to you about my life and also about my art, so you can get a pretty good idea of my background. This first slide is actually a slide of my grade school. I rode a horse to grade school for 3.5 miles. And you see out little building out behind the schoolhouse there, that's where we all tied up our horses. And it was pretty unique. I mean, not too many people have ridden a horse to grade school, but I did. But I had a very unique life growing up on our family farm at Lamar. And so anyway, it was very unique and it was very different, and it was actually a wonderful childhood. This second slide shows 3 of grade school kids drawing water out of the well. Every day we had to draw water out of the well for school, to wash your hands, to drink. So, like I said, it was quite a unique childhood. This third one, out in front of our school, we had a little merry-go-round. You can see there we were all sitting on the merry-go-round. That's me off on the left side there. Third or fourth one over, I guess. I'm on the front, right on the front. This shows several of us on our horses. Like I said, we all rode our horses to school. You see one kid there on a bike. You know, it's kind of funny. I always wished I had a bike to ride, and so many kids wished they had a horse to ride. So you also see that some of the kids standing up on top of the stairs, saluting the flag. This is another one of us out in front on our horses, bike rider, kids standing up on the merry-go-round. Very unique. It was a wonderful place to go to school with just a small bunch of kids, elementary school. We had an upstairs and a downstairs. And the kids that were the older kids, that like the 7th and 8th graders, they would go downstairs with us when we were 1st and 2nd, 3rd grade, and then help to teach us our multiplication tables and how to spell. So that was fun. We had one teacher, and so that was great. This is another one of us, and we're standing on top of the merry-go-round, and if you'll notice, I've got a gun sticking in my waist. A lot of times we made these little rubber band guns, and we'd take them to school, and at recess we'd chase each other around shooting our rubber band guns at everyone. During my lifetime, there were, 5 events that each time, not realizing at the time, but they had a dramatic effect on my life as being an artist. And like I said, at the time, I didn't even realize it. But the first event that happened is we were helping a neighbor move, and we were downstairs getting stuff out of his basement, and there was this print by Charlie Russell, the famous Western artist from Montana. I'd never seen an image of Charlie Russell's work, and I looked at that and I thought, wow, this is amazing. This is really beautiful, and I think he was a truly amazing artist. And I looked at that and I said to myself, wow, I love this. You know what? I'm going to be the next Charlie Russell. So I started doing cowboy and Indian paintings from that day forward. And I actually started doing artwork when I was about 4 years old. And that was, like I said, when I was about 13. And I did cowboy and Indian paintings all through high school. And then I went away to the University of Denver and studied art. After I graduated from Lamar High School, I decided to go to Lamar Junior College. Doing that so I was able to stay there on the farm and help my dad. And that's where the second event happened. They didn't have art classes at junior college, but so I didn't take art there, but everybody there knew I did art because they saw my paintings all the time. Anyway, my English teacher, her name was Grace Peckman. Grace, at the end of class one day, said, Don, I want you to come in tonight after school's over. I need to talk to you about something. I said, okay. And I thought, oh my God, what did I do? I must have done something terribly wrong. She needs to have me come in to see her. Anyway, after class, I went to see her, and when I walked in, she had all these books laid out on her desk, and they were books from different colleges. And Grace says, Don, she said, you know, you have a gift for art. You need to go away and study art. And she said, here's books, catalogs from all the different universities around, and I want you to take these with you, go home, show them to your parents, and tell them that I say that you have got to go away and study art. And I did. And so I did, and I went to the University of Denver. That's actually when the next event happened. I was the only art student to ever win the Purchase Award at the Denver Art Museum. They had a show called the Own Your Own that was open to professional and non-professional artists. I was doing sculpture at DU, and outside of class, I did this welded buffalo and brought it to class and had it in school. And I entered it in the Own Your Own, and I won the Purchase Award. The third major event that affected my life was at the University of Denver. I was in my design class, and John Sorby was my teacher. And one day John said, Don, what do you do? And I said, well, I do paintings of cowboys and Indians. And he said, what? I said, yeah, I do paintings of cowboys and Indians. And he said, well, can I come over to your house and look at them? And I said, sure. And he was always, like I said, he was a great teacher. I really liked him. And I was always the teacher's pet because I could draw better than anybody else. So anyway, he was very interested in what I was doing, so he wanted to come over to my house. So he did. He came over, and I had all my paintings lined up against the wall, the cowboy and Indian paintings, which were kind of Russell and Remington-esque kinds of paintings. And he went from one to the next one, didn't say anything. Finally, about the third or fourth one, he picked it up. He wheeled around facing me, and he's holding the painting towards me, and he says, Don, do you realize it's not 1890? And when he said that, I guess my mind was ready, but it was because it was like a bomb went off in my head, and I never painted another cowboy and Indian painting. Because I all of a sudden realized that art is about your life, not somebody else's life. But I loved doing sculpture. I did advertising design was my major, but I love sculpture. And here's a few of the one of the buffalo you just saw, and this is a bronze casting I did of a horse. Here's one I did of a figure. This next one is a walnut sculpture of a fish form. Then when I was in grad school, I had a design teacher, a ceramics teacher that was really hardcore that I loved. His name is Herb Schumacher. And I did a lot of ceramics. And I learned how to throw the first year. I got, actually, the funny thing was that when I first signed up to take sculpture, and I said I was going to take a class from Herb Schumacher, everybody said, well, nobody has ever gotten an A from Herb Schumacher their first semester. And I said, well, I'm going to. And I did. And so I was feeling like I was pretty cocky, that I was pretty hot stuff. But I did learn how to throw really well. Anyway, I thought I knew how to throw really well. Then the second year, when I went back to Greeley and was taking class from him, I made a bunch of pots, and I had them sitting on the shelf. And then the next day I came in, I was going to put a foot on all of them. I looked around, and all my pots were in the slump bucket. And I thought, oh, my God, I don't get it. And Schumacher was sitting there kind of in the corner room, throwing on the wheel, as he always did. And I said, Mr. Schumacher, Somebody threw my pots away, and he didn't even look up. He just kept throwing. He said, "Oh, yeah, I did. The next ones will be better." And I got the message. I really wasn't as hot as I thought I was. Here's another one of the little pots that I threw in his class. There are 3 more. Then this is a hand-built pot. The thing I finally got to a point where I kind of got bored with throwing, but I love to do hand building. And this is a raku big bowl with the whole flowers or weeds or whatever. But I like doing those. And I got to a point where I enjoyed so much more doing the hand building than the throwing. This is another one. This is actually a piece I did for my daughter. She liked Day of the Dead, and I made this skeleton on this pot for her. This is one of the big plates that I made. I made a bunch of these raku plates, and then I'd put images on those of different things I was doing. And this is a rabbit. This was another one I did for Tanya, for my daughter. Kind of, it's actually, I did these art workshops around the country and also in Colorado Springs, and I always did this gigantic still life that was like 25 foot tall. And on the front of the still life, I had this skeleton I'd put on there, and I put this deer's head on top of it. But I did this as sort of a takeoff from that still life that I did every year. This is another one. This is a raku sculpture that I did for my youngest son, this angel, for cord. In fact, you'll see that heart right above the angel's head, and it says cord on the heart. So anyway, while I was at the University of Denver, everybody painted non-objective at that time. That was in the 50s, and actually they wouldn't even allow you to paint realistic there. So I painted non-objective. I was influenced by a lot of the different non-objective painters. But then after I got out of college, I started going back down to Lamar, and I started sort of adapting my work, my non-objective work, to a little bit of the feel of the landscape around Lamar. So this is an example of one of those. This is another one that you can see. It looks like very landscape-like, tree forms. This is another one. This actually, at our farm at Lamar, there was a large irrigation ditch that ran down through the center of our farm. Our farm was a full section, and on each half, right down through the middle of it, was this big irrigation ditch with a lot of cottonwoods in the ditch. And this is actually a painting of that big ditch. This is another one. This was one of the few that I did that was sort of mountains, showed mountain imagery. I was up in Evergreen for a while, and so I did a few of the images that were influenced by the landscape there. This is another one that's obviously very much mountains, with the clouds form in the back. Another one, sort of the marshy land. I did a lot of, at that time I was doing a lot of watercolor paintings, and I was entering Watercolor USA every year. And actually this was won one of the top awards at Watercolor USA in Springfield, Missouri. And here we were up at Evergreen. I was one of the 6 artists around the United States that was selected to be the artist in residence in the schools. And so they built me a really nice studio at the school in one of the rooms. And the whole idea that kids in the school, in the high school, would be able to come in and see an artist actually painting as they did it every day in their studio. In fact, this is a picture here inside my studio. The fourth major event that affected my life was while I was teaching art at Boulder High School. And I had 7 teachers that taught for me. I was head of the art department there. One of the teachers was a guy by the name of Ken Fisher, and Ken was a big druggie. He did a lot of drugs. He loved drugs. And ironically, I think I may be the only professional artist in America that's never smoked pot, which is kind of crazy when you think I'm from Boulder, Colorado. Anyway, Ken came in one day and he came up to me. He said, "Oh my God, Don." He said, "I was high on drugs last night. I went to this movie. It was really crazy, wild." He said, "There was colors going every different direction." He said, "It was so amazing." He said, "You've got to go see this movie." I said, "Well, what was it?" He said, it was called 2001 Space Odyssey. I said, "Okay, I'll go see it." Well, I went to see it, never thinking it would have an effect on me. And later I found that there were many artists that were greatly affected by this movie. I came out of that movie, I went home, and I did my first religious symbolist space painting. And I never painted the landscapes after that night. I painted these religious symbolist paintings for the next 12 years. And here's some examples of some of them. This is one you can kind of see the edge of the earth and a planet in the background there. You see this form in the foreground here, which is sort of another way I depicted the symbol that was in the movie. In the movie, there was this monolith, which to me was symbolic of God. And to me, that's what the movie was about, that it was for the first time man saw proof that God existed. This is another one. And I was using, at that time, I started doing airbrush for the first time, and I would paint the surface. I would lift the canvas up and drip it and let the paint run. And then I would come back into it with my airbrush and paint layers and layers of paint over the top with airbrush. This is another one. You see that little red line down in the bottom there? It was like symbolic of like the symbol of God coming down out of the sky. Another one. That image, by the way, was triggered by, we were down at Lamar visiting my parents, and we were on the way back to Denver, and we were maybe 40 miles out of Denver, and I looked up, and all of a sudden I saw this incredible bright red line that looked like it was coming down out of the sky. And I thought, wow, what is that? I couldn't believe it. Well, when I got up there, what it was a foggy night, and there was a well there, an oil well there, and they had a burn-off pit, and the fire was going, and because the sky was so foggy, it was shooting this line straight up into the sky. It was very beautiful. And I remember thinking at the time, wow, how would I feel if instead of that being a burn-off pit and that shooting that line, I got there and that red line was coming down out of the sky? This is another way of interpreting that same thing. This is the monolith, like the monolith, similar to the way it was in the movie. I had an art show in Denver, and this is actually at that opening, and that's one of my paintings in the background of this couple sitting there on the couch. Another one with a monolith in it. And another one. This one has a monolith. Oh, the strange thing was one day I living in Boulder, and I was driving down to Denver, and of course at that time they were just starting to build a lot of the beautiful big glass buildings. And I'm driving along, and I'm looking at those glass buildings, and I thought, they're very similar to the monolith. And I thought, wouldn't it be something if somehow we could pick one of these big glass buildings up, move it down to Lamar, and set it out on the prairie somewhere, and the farmer's going along, and all of a sudden he comes over the ridge, and there's this big glass monolith. How different would we feel about that glass building if it was there in that environment? as opposed to in Denver. Another monolithic one. This was actually one of the ones that won one of the top awards at Watercolor USA also. Here you see the monolith again. This was me working in my studio. This one was actually the form that you see in the foreground. I've always loved, if you're in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and you're going up to Santa Fe, and you come up over that hill, and you see these, over on to the left, you see these wonderful big canyons there, and I've always loved that image, and this was triggered by that image. This is a small watercolor of the monolith. It's another one. This one was the Denver Art Museum had an opening, and I forget how many artists they invited for that opening, but I was one of the artists, and that was one of the paintings I had in that opening. Another monolith. This one was triggered by another image from my childhood. My dad used to have a lot of cows out on the prairie, and at noon, a lot of times, my mom would go take lunch out to my dad, and I'd ride out with her in the car. And at that time, the old cars, the windshield wiper would go back and forth, very slow. And a lot of times I'd sit there as a little kid and I'd watch that thing go back and forth. And believe it or not, this is that windshield wiper. Another one of the monoliths. Another one, this was triggered by an event that happened in my life. I got a phone call when I was at school one day, and they said, your father has just been in a bad accident, or he had a bad accident. He ran off the road, hit this tree, and it's quite likely he will not be alive by the time you get to Lamar. So I rushed home, got Francis and the kids, and we took off for Lamar. Well, we got down there. Well, he was still alive. And I spent that night sitting there in his room watching that heart monitor all night long. This is that heart monitor. Another one. And another one. This one's in the collection of the Oklahoma Art Museum. I had a show of these paintings and went around the country for 3 years, and it was at the Oklahoma Arts Museum, and this is one that they purchased for the museum. One of the next to the last images that I worked with in the religious symbolist paintings was the covenant of the rainbow. God's promise not to flood the earth again. So this one has the rainbow in it. Another one. This painting's 10 feet wide. And this one, a lot of airbrush in this one, as you can see over the top of the layers of paint underneath. Another rainbow painting. This one has a rainbow, but the rainbow is just white in this one. This one actually has both the rainbow and the black rainbow. This is another large painting. This is 10 foot wide, as is this one. So I did a lot of quite large paintings of the religious symbolist work. This is another one. The last image that I worked with the religious symbolist work was the computer card. Now, most people don't even know what a computer card is, but when the computers were kind of getting going in the beginning, you had these computer cards, and on one corner, the card was clipped off, the other one wasn't, but I clipped it off on both sides. But that's that's one of the coming of the rainbows of the computer card. And the computer card, I always thought back and I thought, the computer, for the first time now, man has an excuse not to take responsibility for himself. I can say, well, it's really not my fault. The computer went bad. It's not me. So the fifth major event that affected my career was an event that happened down at Lamar, where Larry Schultz and I were down there goose hunting. And it was a late evening, and there was this we were up at Neosha, and there was this sky that was so beautiful that neither Larry or I could say a word. It was like the whole sky, it was real late evening, and the light was shining across, and these clouds were all across the sky, and it looked like a basketball sticking down, and the light was hitting on all of those, and it was so beautiful, we couldn't believe it. And we were speechless, and finally Larry turned to me and he said, Don, you love this area down here so much, you ought to paint Lamar. And I started thinking about it, and I thought, well, maybe I should. I went back to Denver. I thought about it more and more. And at that time, I was doing 3 paintings for the Governor's Award, and I had to get those done. And then after I got those done, I decided to do paintings of my childhood, of where I grew up. But I wanted them to be much different. Certainly what I didn't want was cowboy and Indians. I wanted paintings of rural America the way it really is today, the way you see it if you're down there. So I went to Lamar with a friend. He helped me. He kind of taught me a little bit how to start using a camera, and then I learned how to use the camera. And I took thousands of shots of Lamar and that other areas, and then I ended up doing 15 paintings called the Lamar series. They were 6x8, 7x10 paintings of rural America. And I thought 15 paintings, it would basically sort of give people the idea of what rural America is really like. And this was the first painting that I did of that series. This is one of the Lamar series. This is one called Prairie Rattler. The head on that rattlesnake in the painting is about 3 feet wide, so it's a very large painting. But as growing up, we were constantly around rattlesnakes at Lamar. Fortunately, I never got bit by a rattler, but it's very unbelievable that I didn't, because I had so many close calls with prairie rattlers. In fact, one time I remember I killed in 1 week riding my horse to grade school, I killed a rattlesnake on the way to school every day. So that'll give you an idea of just how thick they were when I was a kid. One of my chores as a child was to go out and fill the water tanks every day for the cows. We had like 500 cows in the feedlot. And so I would sit there and waiting for the water to fill up and looking at the reflection of the cows in the water. And this is from that. I was driving, actually I was up between Lamar and Eads, and I'm driving along, and on the right-hand side there was this farmer, and he was feeding his cows, and I stopped, and I asked him, I said, you know what, I'm Don Coen. I said, I grew up at Lamar. I'm doing a series of paintings of Lamar area, and I said, I'd like to take some photographs of you feeding your cows, if that'd be all right. He said, no problem. So I did, and of course, I never knew at that time that this was going to end up being one of the 15 paintings, but it did. So after the painting series first opened at the museum in Colorado Springs, and I stopped at his house, and I said, hey, you may remember I stopped and talked to you about I was going to artist, and I was going to do some paintings. I said, I ended up doing paintings of you on the tractor. And I said, I'd love for you and your wife and your family to come to the opening. He said, yeah, we'd love to. Well, I know he had never been in a museum in his life. And at the opening, he and his wife and his 2 kids, they stood in front of that painting for at least 45 minutes. And I know they were mesmerized by it. So I've always thought what that must have felt like to him to have that painting of him in a museum. One of the paintings of the Lamar series was this farm dog on the farm right next to our farm, Jimmy Ellenberger's dog. And this actually became the painting that we used for the poster and for advertising the show. This is another one. This was my father and a neighbor. At this time, we had our cows up on the prairie, up around La Junta, and we were up there rounding up the cattle and branding. And this is one of the shots we took. This was my cousin, Norman, and my father. They were spraying weeds. See, we had to burn off the weeds in the irrigation ditch before we'd irrigate each year. This is 2 of our horses. Like I said, I rode a horse to grade school every day for 8 years. And every morning, and this is the way I like to think about horses. A lot of times people think about horses like you see in some of these commercials of these beautiful horses galloping across the plains or across the prairie. This is the way I always thought of horses. You'd go out there in the morning and your horse is standing there in the corral. His eyes are closed and he's just standing there, and you can rub him on the nose. And I'd saddle him up, or I'd put a bridle on him and ride to school. This is one of those paintings you can see. That's the one that I just showed you before. But I'm showing you this so you can kind of see the scale of the painting. This is another one. Actually, this is my son. We were down there goose hunting, and we always went goose hunting a lot there. And this is early morning dawn shot. Shane standing out beside the pickup. This is my father. This is up at Queens Lake. I always loved, one of the images I always loved when I was a kid, and I still do, is out on the prairie, you'd see these pickups coming maybe 5 miles away, and you'd see this dust. They're kicking up this dust as they go along on the dirt roads. And I've always really liked that. I've always thought it was beautiful. This is one of the paintings. It's the outlet of Neosha Reservoir, where I spent a lot of time as a kid duck hunting and goose hunting. Our neighbor to the west, he raised these landrace hogs, and I took a picture of those. This is an image that's always close to my heart. This painting is owned by the Denver Art Museum. When I told you I used to go out on the prairie with my mother when she'd go out to take lunch to my dad, and a lot of times we'd stop by these potholes where they had dug the water, that dug out, and rainwater would fill up in there for the cows to drink. And then on the back of those, you see there's two railroad ties. And then in between those, you see a rope and a sack. Well, that sack had medicine in it, so the cows could walk back and forth and rub their back on that. Medicine would come out on their back, and that would keep the flies off of them. Another one showing the close-up of the reflections in the water. Now, some of these these are not all part of the Lamar series. That's finished, but after I finished that Lamar series and it traveled around the United States, I continued to do paintings of rural America, and all. This is an example of some of those. This is actually over towards Lincoln, Nebraska, and I've always loved that sound of when the sprinklers were going, when they're watering the fields. The sound of it is very beautiful. This was on this one guy's farm and his cows. This is my friend's farm up at Greeley, Colorado, and that's actually him standing there. And I love paintings of combines and old trucks and things like that. This is a painting owned by the Denver Art Museum. It's called Yellow Rain Jacket. And this was an image I took up at Cheyenne Frontier Days, but I wanted peoples to focus on the rain jacket and the saddle. And so I purposely did not show the head or the tail of the horse. This is another one that I took up there at Cheyenne Frontier Days. This is actually in the museum in Wyoming. But I always thought this was a beautiful saddle, the way the light was hitting on the saddle. This painting actually just ended up at the Denver Art Museum. A collector bought this painting, and he was going to buy a painting for the Denver Art Museum, he and his wife, and they came to my studio, and he saw this painting, and he fell in love with it because he said, that combine is exactly the combine I used to use all the time. And he said, so he ended up buying that one for himself and the one of the pothole for the museum. So this is down south of Lamar and Branding Day. I've always loved this painting. I've always wished that I would have bought that steer on the front there and saved his life because he's so beautiful. This was in the feedlot at Ordway. This is a oil stick of combines out east of Lamar, east of our farm. These are a couple horses in the feedlot on the edge of Lamar. This was a painting, actually is in the museum in Phoenix. I always loved that, you'd see these airplanes come in early in the morning and spray the fields, and it was very pretty, very beautiful. So this is an image that I took up close around Rocky Ford one snowy morning. I've always loved that feeling of when it's snowing, large, big snowflakes, and they're gently coming down out of the sky, and the way you see those against an image here against the cows. These are Jimmy's sheep. This is oil stick. And Jimmy Elmberger, he's the one that had the farm dog, but these are some of his sheep. I did a piece of his sheep. This was around Lamar also. I was attracted to this image because I thought it was so beautiful. That horse's eye was very unusual. Black face, black cows with white face, cross between Angus and Herefords. This has always been one of my favorite images. We always went down to Rocky Ford when my mother-in-law lived there, and her husband died, and she remarried, And the man that she remarried, he loved, when we were down there, he always loved for me to take him for rides around out in the country. And it was Christmas morning, and CR said, let's go for a ride. I said, okay. So I always kept my camera with me. We were riding. We were out east of town. And all of a sudden, I looked up, and I saw these sheep walking right down the middle of the highway. And I thought it was an unbelievable image. I jumped out of the car, laid down in the middle of the street, and shot 2 or 3 rolls of film of these sheep as they were coming towards me. And I looked at this figure, and it was such an eerie image. And I thought, is this Christ coming towards me? It's another one of horses. Another one. This one, there was a ranch for a while south of Lamar, between Lamar and Springfield, where this guy had a big ranch of longhorn cattle, and I went down there quite a few times and shot pictures of them. This was up by Rocky Ford. This was by Lyman. This is an image of my dad up at Queens Reservoir in his pickup coming towards me. These are 2 of my dad's cows I did a painting of. Actually, that's what I named it, Dad's Cows. This is another one of Dad up at Queens coming up this hill that's on top of this hill where I'm standing, where I took that picture, is my favorite spot of all the world. And I've always loved this image and this spot of this road that goes down to Queens Reservoir. This is a feedlot at Rocky Ford. This is out east of Denver. This is the other rattlesnake image that I did. You saw the one rattlesnake. This is the other one. Actually, both of those were purchased for the Jackson Museum in Wyoming, both this one and the other one, both. It's another painting of the feedlot up at Rocky Ford. We had a beautiful Australian shepherd, and I did a painting of Matisse. His name was Matisse, and I did a painting of him, which was kind of symbolic of the one of the farm dog painting. Matisse here was standing kind of in front of a car tire at Lamar. I did that. This is a field with irrigation running through it at Rocky Ford. This is at Lamar, the feedlot at Lamar. This is a painting of these cows in Washington. I had this collector, or I thought it was going to be a collector. He said, I would like you to come up here and take a picture at my ranch, and I'd like to have you do a painting for me. So I flew up there, or rode, I can't remember. Anyway, I was up there, and he was actually a friend of mine. So we went up there, and I went out there on his ranch, and I took a bunch of pictures, and I did this painting. It was 10 foot wide. And then I took it up to his place in Seattle. Turns out he didn't buy it, so I had to go get it back. So anyway, this is north of Boulder. This is a painting I did for Red Rocks Community College. When I left there, I did a big painting. I can't remember whether it's 8 or 10 feet wide of these cows in the wintertime with the snow on the fence and the weeds. This was at Holyoke, Colorado. There's some cows in the feedlot. This is also up in that area. This is an image on Highway 52 outside of Boulder to the north. I'd always loved this ranch, and I'd drive by it and I'd think, oh, that is such a beautiful ranch. And so one day I was out shooting photographs, and it was just before dawn. It was just starting to get light. And I thought, oh, I'm going to go in there. I'm going to go down there and take a picture at their house. And so I drove down this driveway, pulled around the corner there, and got out of my pickup and started to take some photographs. And you see the house there on the right side. Just as I did that, this guy came walking out on the porch, and he says, "What the hell are you doing out here?" And I said, well, I'm an artist, and I wanted to take some pictures of your place. He said, well, you didn't ask. Get the hell out of here. So I said, okay. So I got back in my pickup and drove back down the driveway here. And when I got right here, I stopped. I thought, well, I'll take some pictures from here. He can't stop me. So I took this picture, and ironically, I ended up doing a painting of this. And the funny thing about it was I was having a show at one of the galleries in Boulder, and this painting was in that show, and they had it in the window to advertise the show. Well, it just so happened that this farmer and his wife were walking down the street in Boulder, and all of a sudden he looks up and he sees this painting in the window. He goes running into the gallery and he says, "That's our place, that's our place." And he was really excited. And so they took 2 chairs out in the street, and he and his wife sat out there in those chairs for a long time, they said, looking at the painting. And I always thought, oh, I wish they would have called me. I would have loved to have come down and say, hey, I'm the guy that you said, get the hell out of here. It was a funny story. This was north of Lamar, some people raising little pigs. Pigs are such cute things. And there you see their feeder behind them there. This was, actually this painting was from California. I had this collector that collected my work, and they had me fly out. They had bought my work at Joanne Lyons Gallery up in Aspen, and they flew me out there. They wanted me to do some paintings. And so I did 3 or 4 paintings for them, and then the wife calls me up and said, you know, I've got this great idea. She said, I want to fly you back out here, and I'm not going to tell my husband that you're coming, and I want you to be out here in the wheat field, and I'm going to have him drive the combine, although he normally doesn't, and I want you to take some pictures of him and do a painting for us. And I said, oh, okay. I said, let me see if I've got this straight. I said, I'm going to come out there, and I'm going to be standing out here in the middle of a wheat field in front of him, and I'm going to take his picture without him knowing it, right? She started laughing. She says, well, that doesn't make much sense, does it? I said, no. She said, well, come out anyway. I'll tell him you're coming, and we'll do the painting. So we did. I always loved doing images of horses and cows and snowstorms, and this is one of them. This painting was of Jimmy Elmberger's cows. One of a fox. Another one of a feedlot. This is out south of Lamar, just early in the morning, just as it's starting to get light. You could just barely, you could make out the images, but it was, of course, it was in the wintertime. The cows standing there. It was done in oil stick. This is a lake. There's a lake up near Longmont, and I did several paintings for this company that was up there, and this is one I did for them. This is just to give you again the size of the scale. This was an image of horses that I did that were at the, let's see, I'm trying to remember which, I think it was Cheyenne Frontier Days, but I'm not positive. It doesn't matter. But anyway, I just loved the bridles on these horses. I thought they were very beautiful. So I did that. There are these water tanks between Rocky Ford and Lamar that were made out of concrete. And I always thought they were beautiful. And there was actually one in Rocky Ford. And I went to those and I took paintings of the cows drinking out of them. And I look at this image, and to me it was sort of like, and I think I named this one chairman of the board, and all the people around the glass table getting ready to have a meeting. But this is another one. One was called boardroom, and the other one was called chairman of the board. That's Lee Iacocca right there in the middle. But of course, most people don't even know who Lee Iacocca is, but some of you might. It's another one. This is the horses. There's a beautiful ranch between Cara Springs and Pueblo on the west side of the road. And this guy has beautiful horses, and I've stopped there and I've photographed his horses a lot. Actually, the ironic thing about it is that the guy that owns this ranch was the first Marlboro Man. And when you go in his office, you see all these posters of him as the Marlboro Man. This is an image from the Cheyenne Frontier Days of horse drinking. This is a print of two cattle in a snowstorm. You can see it was framed, the way it's framed. Oh, excuse me, this isn't a print, this is actually a painting. I'm sorry, a big painting. This image I saw. I was driving back from Cheyenne, and I looked over to the side and I saw these horses drinking out of the edge of the highway, and I jumped out and took their pictures. I thought it was a very beautiful image. This is one of my favorite paintings. I'd go visit my son in Minnesota, and on the way back, a lot of times in Nebraska, there's a museum for Buffalo Bill. And I stopped there. There used to be a restaurant right next to the museum, and I stopped there and I was eating breakfast, and I came out and there was this great farm dog standing in the back of this pickup. And in the background was the huge, at the Buffalo Bill Museum, there was a image of Buffalo Bill that was like at least 30 feet tall, maybe more, but it was in the background. And so I thought it was so cool. So I took a picture of this, knowing I would probably do a painting. Actually, I put a note on the guy's windshield and I said, "I'm Don Coen, I'm an artist." And I said, "I'm going to do a painting of this." But he never did contact me. Anyway. This is a print, and I really like this print because it gives the feeling of the cold winter time with the wind blowing really, really hard. Another print of the cows. Another monotype. I did a lot of monotypes. Same thing, another monotype. And another one. And another one. I love the abstract quality of these. You can see they're very abstract. There was this beautiful longhorn steer that these people saw, and they bought it to save its life, and they lived up at Aspen, on the edge of Aspen. And I heard about this steer, so I went out there and took a bunch of pictures of it. But he was very, very pretty. This was in Nebraska, a cornfield in Nebraska. Another one, this is an image of that longhorn steer. Another print. These are monotype prints now. Another one. This was a painting I did of these people that collected my work. They lived at Laredo, Texas, and this was a painting of her horse, Haley's horse. Image of a buffalo. This is a print I did of that image of the horses with the bridles, beautiful bridles. This was at North Platte, Nebraska. My wife and I, a lot of times when we were going to visit our son in Montana, we'd stop there at North Platte, spend the night, and I'd walk down on the river and photograph the Platte. This is that same guy up in California. Here's some, I do these drawings with it. I take a dead stick off a tree, and I have my iPad sitting on the pool table looking at the image, whatever it is, whether it's a horse, cow, chicken, you name it. And then while I'm looking at that, I very quickly, in a very gesture-like way, draw the image. And I like using this dead stick because when you push down hard on this dead stick, it jumps and makes this little staccato line, as you can see here. And so I dip that stick in in black ink. I draw the image, and then while the image is still wet, I take a large brush and I take walnut ink, and sometimes I thin it way down like I did here. And then here I just did the background. A lot of times I go into the image and let the walnut ink bleed. So here's some more examples of different ones. There you can see. Another one. One of goats. Another goat. And you see, I love that little staccato line, the way it, and it also, when you press down, the ink kind of squirts out in a line too, which I also love that. Another one. And here's just a whole bunch of the different ones of the drawing with the dead stick. Yeah. Another one. I love goats. They have such great faces. I really like their faces. They kind of look at you like they're trying to read your mind or something. They're also great shapes. And here's a jackrabbit and a chicken, which I like this image a lot. The last or the sixth event that affected my art and my career was while I was up at Greeley, just south of Greeley, and I was photographing these cows. I turned around and I saw these migrants sitting on these sacks of onions that they had just finished. I looked over there, and it was the way the light was shining, it was shining through their bandanas, and I thought, wow, that's a beautiful image. So I walked over and I said, say, would you guys mind if I took your picture? They said no. So I talked to them a while and took their pictures. And I started on the way back to Boulder, and I'm driving along, and I'm thinking, you know what? I grew up around migrants. I worked with migrants. I worked every bit as hard as migrants growing up. Nobody's ever really painted the migrants, to my knowledge. And I thought, who better than me, who grew up around migrants and saw how hard they worked? So I decided to do a painting of migrant workers, and like with the Lamar series, I decided to do 15 paintings of migrant workers. And so I spent several years traveling around the United States photographing and documenting migrant workers. After about the third year, and I went from Texas to Washington, from California to Florida, took I don't know how many, probably several thousands images of migrants, and then I decided to do the 15 paintings. This is the first one I did. This is of Manuel, and you can see I picked this one for that very same reason of that first day I saw the migrants with the sun shining through their bandanas. But I also thought that Manuel had a beautiful, beautiful face, which he does. And over on the left, you can see those are the sacks of onions that are on the left, and there's his pickup. And I love this hat that he had, Al's Turf Bar. And I called later, I thought, God, I'd like to have one of those hats. So I called down there, but the bar had gone out of business, so I couldn't get one. So the second one is of Isabel. This was his daughter. She was a very beautiful girl, and she had on a hat, Colorado Rockies hat, and ironically at that time, I looked at that hat and I didn't even know that that was a Colorado Rockies hat, but I thought she had a beautiful face, really pretty eyes, pretty mouth. This one, it's kind of funny. Before I would photograph the people, I'd go up to them and I'd spend quite a long time talking to them to try to put them really at ease. This was one of the few images that I took with a telephoto lens where she was probably at least 30 or 40 yards away from me. But I thought it was such a powerful image. But of course, again, I didn't know that I was going to end up doing this in one of the 15 paintings, but I did. And at the time, I called her Mother Earth because she looked like such a powerful woman. Later, when I was going around photographing, I had taken some images of some of the paintings that I'd already done, including this one. I was down at Rocky Ford, Colorado, and I was showing a bunch of the migrants some of the images, and this girl says, "Oh my God, that's my mother. Her name is Aurelia." So I learned, quite by accident, I found out that Mother Earth was Aurelia. This is one it was called The Onion Harvesters. What I like about this image is you start with the figure in the front and your eye kind of goes back to the second figure, then it goes back to the guy with the green hat, then it goes over to the cars, and so your eye is sort of led all the way through the image by the composition. This is Liliana. She is a beautiful, beautiful girl. She had a twin sister. They looked exactly alike. The only difference was Liliana had this beautiful little mole on her upper lip. But I thought she was such a beautiful, beautiful girl. This is Pablo. This was up in Idaho and close to Washington. And they were harvesting apples there, and I'm walking around through the orchard, and he's standing there. And I started talking to him, and I finally, after a while, and I loved his face. He had a wonderful face. And I said, would you mind if I took some pictures of it? He said, no, but he said, could I take my hat off? I said, yeah, you can see the line on the side of his head. But I thought this was such a great image with the way his face and the apples around it. So I love this image a lot. This was out in California. This is McGill. And the flower fields in California. I went out there and photographed all the farm workers working in the flower fields. And again, this is one of the things when I did the a migrant series, one of the things I want to happen is when people go to the grocery store now, or they go to the Whole Foods and they see these beautiful displays of flowers, what I'm hoping is they'll say, oh, wow, now I know where that came from, these farm workers. This is Martine. This was up in Idaho, and I always loved his face. I think he looks I've always thought he looked sad, but he was very friendly and very happy guy. But when I started photographing, but I always thought his face was very Christ-like, a very beautiful image. This is Jack. I love this image of Jack. I love the bandana, and it's a cool image. His mother lived close to Rocky Ford, and I used to stop and talk to his mother. She doesn't live there anymore, but for a while, she and Jack's brother lived there in that town. This is Marissa, and what I love about this is I love when I was a kid, my mom used to can peaches all the time. And so I was very much drawn to this image, and she's mixing up the fruit there. And I just think it was such a great image. And actually there were 2 or 3 of them that were doing it, and at the time, I didn't know which one I was going to do, but I ended up doing her. I loved the scarf that she had on her head. I loved the way she was just looking at the peaches and mixing them up. I thought it was really cool. This is Adrian. This was out in California. I stopped there. They were harvesting, and I stopped, and I was photographing some other people, and Adrian came up to me and he said, would you like to take my picture? And I ended up taking a bunch of pictures of him, and he ended up being one of the paintings. This is Rosa and Cristobal, and this was in California, and it was kind of cool because they were out there harvesting the strawberries, and I was getting ready to take some pictures of Rosa, and she said, would you mind taking my husband's picture? He's really wanting you to photograph him. I said, tell him to get over here. So he came over, and I photographed him also. This is Angel. This was in California, and I'll never forget, this was along the coast, and I stopped there, and these people were harvesting celery, and he had on sort of rubberized coveralls. He had on gloves, and it was hotter than hell. And I remember saying, I said, you bend over all day long cutting this stuff and put it in rows, and then they spray it with water. I said, this is really hard work. And he says, yeah, I love it, which I thought was a great statement. This is Francisco and his son Juan. My daughter and we were down at Rocky Ford, and we'd been photographing the migrants all day long. And then there was a great camp there where they had built all these really nice houses and a school for the kids. And Tanya and I went over there, and they were sitting there. His wife was cutting. There were about 4 or 5 of the guys standing there, and she was cutting all their hair. And after she got through cutting their hair, Francisco was sitting there, and his son Juan came running out of the house there and got up in his lap, and they were all sitting there having a drink. And I thought this was great, because one of the things also I think is important to think about is the relationship. Family is very important to the migrants. And this is a great example of showing that. This last one was Victor. This was down in Florida. I went down there to photograph the migrants. And I always loved this image of Victor. I like the look on his face. I love the way his hair was coming out, his mustache. And I just thought it was a very cool image. So anyway, that's the 15 migrant images. I've thought about doing another series. I don't know whether I'm up to it or not. I may. If I do, it'll be called Flyover Country. And it would be what we see between New York and California, which they don't know anything about, which is almost everything. But the first images, there's several images that I would have got in my mind. Number one, the first one or two paintings that I would do would be of these snake handlers in Texas. Because if you've ever been to a rattlesnake roundup, it's about as wild as it can possibly get. It's very crazy. And I would also like to do one of a rodeo queen, a bull rider, but all kinds of different occupations, which are, very unusual. So I don't know if I'll ever end up doing it, but I've thought about it a lot. So anyway, those are images that tell you about my work. Thank you.